Tips from Trestle is brought to you by the Boelter Companies, Navigator Group Purchasing, eMenuChoice Point of Sale, and Clark Food Service Equipment. Welcome to Tips from Trestle, the Senior Living Food and Hospitality Podcast. This podcast explores the senior living industry with a unique focus on food, hospitality, and the community experience. I'm your host, Aaron Fish. My goal for this podcast: educate, inform, and inspire leaders in senior living. How? By bringing the resident and customer experience to the front of mind in our industry. We should bring the passionate spirit of food and hospitality to everything that we do and everyone we serve each and every day. So what are we waiting for? Let's get to it. Today on Tips from Trestle, I'm joined by Jill Valdez. Jill is the founder and COO of Link, working with executive directors to lead committed staff who provide stellar care. She has been helping people for over 20 years, helping with better systems for their company, helping with better communication, helping them with overcoming obstacles that keep them from being all that they are purposed to be. Jill has assisted various companies through Link in improving company culture, teaching staff how to best communicate with each other and their clients, directing leaders to effective hires, and so much more. Jill, thanks for joining me today on Tips from Trestle.
It's great to be here, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
So, obviously, you're a well-rounded coach, but you've kind of chosen to work more focused in the senior living space. So, what kind of sparked that passion for coaching professionals in the senior living space?
For 4 years, I was in a couple of different roles in hospice. And most recently, I was the director of operations for a hospice agency. And, I saw the struggle for leaders in senior care. They were doing, especially with the pandemic, like everybody was really upset, but their struggle was so much more intense.
Mm,
And coming out of it, there's not been a lot of learning on their part. What I'm hearing now so much is, well, let's get back to what we were doing before COVID, which already wasn't really necessarily working per se.
yeah.
And so I saw how much they were struggling. And I know from my experience in senior care that they're in that position because they have this huge heart for care. They have this huge heart for the residents and the patients that they're giving service to.
Mm,
And so I want to be that guide and that partner to walk alongside them to help them achieve the level of care that they believe that they should be able to provide. Um, in September, I was laid off from the hospice agency. They did some restructuring and changed their staffing model, eliminated my role across the nation. And
yeah.
so that's how I found myself saying, okay, well, I'm going to get back to consulting and coaching, and I know who exactly I want to be working.
Yeah, it's interesting for you to make the connection to COVID and post-COVID and that, hey, what worked before should work now that we kind of had this blip in the map where we did some things different. Now let's get back to business as usual. And we're still dealing with kind of some of the after effects of, well, that blip kind of left some scars, right?
Yeah.
And so you're specializing in working with like executive directors. And so what inspired you to kind of focus on not just them, but that like day-to-day operation and how they can struggle and how they get through that without having the struggle, if you will?
Yeah. So when I got my start in senior care a few years ago, I started like most people. I started as a caregiver. I enjoyed it. I was good at it. I got promoted to being a med tech. I enjoyed that. I was good at it. And next thing you know, I'm managing a small assisted living facility. There was training on the tasks of the job, and there was absolutely no training on how to lead people. And I see that so frequently. People in senior care are promoted because they have the heart and the passion for care. And there's training on the particulars of the role, but there seems to be this disconnect. What I've seen is that owners and operators and managers, they have this expectation
Mhm.
that executive directors are going to be so good at caring for their team because they were such great caregivers.
Yeah.
But it's a totally different skill set. And again, when I see good people with good hearts and good intention struggling, that that activates a thing in me that says, I want to be a solution. I want to help. Anybody who follows me on LinkedIn, if you look at my website, my byline is that no one should be held back by obstacles that they can overcome. I feel that very strongly for those in leadership care.
Yeah, I think you make a great point, and that's part of part of what I focus on when I think about the food service and the hospitality programming is they got the nuts and bolts of like we can order food, we can put it on the plate, we can cook it. But then there's the how do we deal with the residents and all the softer skills that come with managing in a senior living community tend to not be something that is something that's prioritized necessarily in training programs. And so I think that makes a lot of sense what you're saying about that. And so when we think about that and those soft skills and some of those opportunities, what do you see as some of the more common challenges your clients face, and how do you start to help them overcome those challenges?
Yeah. The One of the big challenges I see is that they've not learned how to transfer their heart and their mind into the people that they're leading. And so that's one of the places that I start is teaching them how to help their staff take ownership of the work that they're doing. You know, I've seen it and I'm sure you have too. So often there's people who get started in senior care as caregivers because they're like, man, that's gonna be a cushy job. It's just like taking care of grandma and grandpa. You know,
Yeah,
that's a totally different world.
definitely.
So helping those leaders be able to transfer that heart and mind and activate the passion and the heart and the ownership of the staff that they're leading.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because when you think about getting those caregivers and they struggle, that frontline staff of the transition from that thought of, oh, well, it's just taking care of grandma and grandpa. No, there's a lot more to it. You know, the transferring that leader's ability and understanding, it's not necessarily a one to one and straightforward. Like that's where some of those additional skills come in because you've got to be able to communicate the right way. You got to be able to manage different personalities and I see like you said, operators can struggle with that because especially with some of the other outside forces that are like, let's worry about census and do you have your right ratios and what about the budget? And so once you start working through some of those other issues, uh, we just kind of tend to lose sight of the people, right? And I think that's interestingly enough, we are an industry of people serving people, and we kind of sometimes forget that when we're running the day to day.
Which it's easy to do because yes, you are serving people, but there is that business aspect. I
Right.
I had that when I was in the nonprofit sector. It was very much a service-based corporation and success was measured by stories about the people, but it was still a business.
Yeah.
We had to do the right things to keep the lights on, to pay the bills. So I understand that it is a both. It's not one or the other. It is
Right.
definitely both, but let's make sure that it's balanced. And I think, it's good for owners and operators to be focused on the business aspect, but and they have as I'm thinking this through, they have a lot that they can teach executive directors who typically don't have a really big business mindset.
Right.
So there's a lot of teaching that can go that way. However, it's it's reciprocal in that executive directors, they can teach owners and operators about what it means to care for residents. Having those really good conversations about this is why this idea might not work. These are some of the obstacles within that idea. Like, can we talk about this more as opposed to just making this a directive?
Yeah. And I think the other piece of that, which you've kind of alluded to, is when you're taking care of those frontline staff, like they're the ones that honestly are impacting the bottom line, right? Like if the services are good, the caregivers are doing what they're supposed to do, the servers are delivering great meals, all of those things just kind of tend to roll up, right? And now all of a sudden, like you said, once the owners and operators see, well, if we invest in that frontline staff and supporting them, numbers just aren't magically getting better. And I think a lot of times that can be hard because there's not necessarily a KPI that you can, other than maybe like, oh, employee satisfaction, which is very broad and vague. Like there's not a number that you can tie to doing that other than all these other metrics improving because your quality is going up.
For sure. I know that a lot of people look at what I do and go, "Oh, that is so woo-woo." And you're right. It absolutely is. But there are you will I was telling somebody about this. You're gonna sense it. Like I was working with a client one time and they asked me to come in and work with them. The manager was struggling. She was like, "I don't like my team. They're not accountable." She did not have much positive to say about them. So I went in to work with them and discovered that a lot of it had to do with she had a very strong task focused personality.
Mm,
Let's get things done. Let's get it done quickly. Let's be efficient and effective. Great for a manager, super valuable.
right.
But the rest of our team were very people focused and very service focused. So we started talking about how those two different personalities can work better together. And I went back like 6 weeks later, and it was a totally different atmosphere in that office because there was an understanding that again, this is both. This is both of us working together. It wasn't something that they can measure in KPIs. It wasn't like they could go, oh, we're seeing more patients on a daily basis
Mm,
or, XYZ, but you could definitely feel it. And in feeling it long term, some of what if people want to be able to say, oh, how can I measure this? How about measuring fewer call outs? What would
mm,
that be? How
right.
about measuring, you know, people tend to forget about the cost of employee turnover. There is an actual numerical cost.
Yes.
Imagine as an owner operator that all of a sudden you're not having the turnover like you were. You're going to see that in your staffing budget. You're going to see that in, if you have it taken down into budget for onboarding, you're going to see that there. Those are where you're going to eventually see those numbers.
Yeah. It's so interesting you bring up like the retention and the turnover because we know there are numbers out there that, people talk about. It's anywhere from four to $8,000 per frontline employee, depending on position and market and yada yada. But nobody we talk about it, but where is it ever measured, right? Like where does that number go? And I think you make a good point of like if it's important to measure and to understand, like you'll start to see benefits from that. And so one of the things that you kind of talk through it and you kind of on your website, you kind of promote this, like this idea that you've got you call the number one tool to motivate employees to give their very best. And it's not a bigger paycheck. And so I want you, because I feel like you led me right into that question. What is that? Kind of tell us a little bit more about what that could be.
Yeah. You know what that is? That is, and I say this a lot, it's activating their hearts, activating the passion, and it's learning to bring out the best in your people. When they come in to work every day, knowing for one, let's talk about them understanding the significance of the work that they're doing. A lot of times in caregiving, especially the frontline staff, they can feel like, am I really making a difference? Am I really doing something valuable? More than just even for the residents, but for the company. Like everybody wants to know that they have a place of significance. They're contributing to their world.
Yeah.
So when you help them with identifying what they do well and and then also kind of teasing out like how can you improve? So I tell the story like this. When my kids were younger, they did competitive swimming. And competitive swimming, you're swimming against really you're swimming against competitors, but you're also swimming against yourself. And so every time that we would go to a meet, we would measure success by how well you did compared to your last time. Did you improve your last times? Well, it's the same thing. If we give somebody a measurement like that and
Mhm.
say, what can you improve from yesterday? Whether it be an efficiency, whether it be a level of care, what can you do to improve from yesterday? And then keep building on that. Then, then they come in and they know that they're not in competition with anybody else.
Mhm.
So there's none of that threat and there's none of that undermining each other. They're looking at how can I continue to be the best that I am? And in doing that, they're constantly striving for improvement. Well, that that's a motivator. When people go home and go, "Oh man, I had a great day.
Yeah.
It was better than yesterday. And I made a difference." Like, and they can tell stories about what that difference was. Then you have just activated them, you've motivated them, and they're going to be excited to come to work the next day.
Yeah, and I love the ownership piece of that too, right? Because I mean, how many of us have been in those like frontline hourly roles and we've thought, I don't have any stake in any of this, right? I literally am here collecting a paycheck and nobody really cares about the impact I may or may not have. And thinking about the employees that we're recruiting now for those, that Gen Z and even like the older Gen Alpha, right? They're very much like purpose driven and motivated around more altruistic things, right? Like, yes, they want to get the right pay for the work they're doing, but what you talked about with that motivation and that being able to go home and man, I made an impact today, that is a huge thing for them, and I think it's just so important, the things you're saying about how that can impact your entire workforce if done right.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of leads into the idea of what a manager's role is and all of that. The manager, they they need to know their people. They need to know what motivates them. They need to have a relationship with them in order to fully motivate them. And again, then the manager gets to come in and tell a story to the employee and go, "Oh, remember when you were in the dining room and you saw that Mr. Jones was really struggling to eat and you made a suggestion to our cure director about, changing his utensils? Like, we heard that the family called the executive director and was saying thank you. And they were so appreciative of how attentive we are to their loved one and blah, blah, blah. You need to tell them a story about their success and how it did contribute and how the higher ups heard about them.
Yeah. No, it's all super impactful, and I love the way you frame it and really put that emphasis on creating those connections. So, as we kinda wrap up here today, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about what you're doing with Link Consulting and how executive directors can benefit from working with you and how their operations would improve.
Yeah. We talked about it a little bit at the beginning. I see executive directors who they're afraid to hold their team to a higher standard because they're afraid that they're going to quit.
Yeah.
Um, and yet they're watching their staff come in more focused on their own needs than the needs of the residents and those that they're supposed to be caring for. And again, that unrealistic or kind of that unspoken expectation that they're going to be such great leaders because they were such great caregivers.
Yeah.
I know what that's like to not have the training and have all the tools that you need to be successful in your job when all you want to do is just be amazing.
Yeah.
That's really disheartening. And so I'm a guide and I'm a partner for these executive directors. We start with kind of let's let's lay the foundation. The foundation really is going to be communication. So I have a workshop that I do called Cracking the Communication Code. And that's kind of
Yeah.
where we start is let's lay that foundation and let's continue to work together to see what are some of the other cracks and how can we get those fixed. And then after having worked with me, they're gonna they're gonna see reduced turnover. They're gonna see reduced call outs. They're going to see it in their census. They're going to, and, and knowing that when they aren't there, like being able to not have to be on 24/7
Mm,
because they know that they have the staff that is committed and that is going to be providing that stellar care. That gives them a peace of mind and gives them that certainty that they know that they have their dreams.
yeah, it's so needed and beneficial for our industry. So, as we wrap up here, how can listeners connect with you, learn more about working with you, and just kind of get a better understanding of this overall philosophy in general?
Sure, they can. There's a couple of ways. I'm always on LinkedIn, so you can definitely connect with me there. But if you go to linkconsulting.info and click on the consulting for business, then that's going to take you in and give you a more of an idea of what it would be like to work with me. And also there's ways that you can connect with me through there.
Perfect. Jill, I love it when we get a chance to talk about like supporting staff and building those connections. And so I think you have a great approach, and I appreciate so much you coming on and sharing it with listeners today.
Thanks for having me, Erin. I really
Uh,
enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. So there it is, everybody. Another one in the books. Thanks again for tuning in. Please follow, like, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media at Tips from Trestle. You can also learn more about the work I do by following me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. And be sure to check out Trestle Hospitality Concepts at www.trestlehospitalityconcepts.com. I'm your host, Aaron Fish, and this has been another episode of Tips from Trestle.